Hey everyone, this is Craig Brasco again. I'm an associate professor at Kennesaw State University in the School of Art and Design, and I'm doing some videos this summer for the Summer Arts Intensive. And this one is the second video, and it's about basic character painting. So I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop, and we'll get started. Okay, so if you have not had a chance to watch my video from the first day on how to do basic digital painting, I would recommend watching that one first. There's a couple of things I talk about there that I think are really helpful for this video. So the other thing is, as you see on the screen, this is my email account. So it's cbrasco@kennesaw.edu. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or if you need anything in regards to the work that we're doing for these videos. So I'm gonna switch back over here to show my menu, and I've already kind of done some doodles today to kind of get warmed up, but the general idea here is I get a lot of questions from students all the time about here at KSU about, how do you come up with your character ideas and how do you design characters? That's a really tough question. And I mean, over the years, I've played a lot of games and I've read a lot of books and I've watched a lot of movies and I talk to other people and other artists and their ideas about characters and I read, comic books and stuff. So there's just so many things out there that I guess my mind has been filled with character ideas. But then when it comes to drawing them, it's really hard because, well, I mean, the first thing is you have to draw the human figure. And this is where a lot of people get tripped up. So the first thing I would recommend when it comes to uh, character drawing is you do have to have, I think, some experience with figure drawing. So let me make a new layer here real quick and mention that. So, figure drawing is, well, for me, it was a big life changer in terms of art. And I personally still think to this day, maybe outside of painting and design, like a basic 2D design class, figure drawing's pretty much up there in terms of what I think is every artist should study. Doesn't really matter what you think you're going to pursue. And the reason I say that is because it makes you think about how you draw and it changes how you use your brain and your eyes to draw instead of just um, looking at a piece of paper and not having a reference. So, on the other hand, I did mention design, so I'm going to write that down too. So, design, I think, gets overlooked a lot. And a lot of times you study design, really, I mean, like 2D and 3D design, and you don't really understand what the applications are of these things. And that's funny because it's a lot like math. You have to learn certain things about math, and you're like, why am I doing this? I don't really understand. How am I going to use this later on? Because you're trying to be taught like these fundamental concepts that you can apply later on. And it took me a long time to understand that these were really important concepts that could help me with doing fun stuff like character design and stuff like that. The other, I guess, I did mention painting, so I'm going to put that too. Um, Painting is just typically where you get to encounter color for the first time, which then introduces you to light and how light behaves, and the absence of light was the shadow. So these are definitely concepts that you would talk about in 2D design or something like that. But when it comes to actually considering these three elements as being part of a design or the character you're trying to draw, I think um, a lot of practice, drawing from life, painting from life, can be very helpful. So that study we did with the apple, for instance, is a good way to do that. just to practice and get your brain filled with this information. So, it definitely helps to have a lot of context when you design characters. So that's why I'm a big fan of reading. Read as much as possible. Read books. Comic books are great. And, watching TV, watching, a lot of us, that's what we've been doing and during this COVID time. And that's great. The only problem with TV and animation and movies, though, is you're actually looking at somebody else's final production of a character concept. Like you watch, let's say, God, what's the show I've been watching lately? I can't think of, like Westworld. Okay, so on Westworld, there's the character Dolores. So that character had a concept, and somebody got paid to sit down and draw and create these images of what this character is, and then you finally see the character on TV, and your brain just interprets that right away. But you didn't have to like read a script, let's say, to see who was this character, who was this person. That's why I think just looking at the written word can be a lot more interesting. Now, there's nothing wrong with watching film. I think you can learn a lot from that in TV, but read a lot of books. I have a lot of favorites out there, but probably one of the book that I bring up the most with my classes and stuff is a book called Thieves' World. And Thieves' World is an old fantasy anthology from the 80s. And what's really cool about this book is that it was kind of a collection of authors that got together at a convention they were at. And they were like, hey, let's make up all these characters, and then let's make some rules about how they interact, and then go write a story. And then let's meet back here in a year and show each other our stories. And it was really cool. They actually did this, and then the first book they wrote just really took off, and then it just got more and more popular. So when I read these books, it's some of the best examples of character design, because that's what it's all about, is how the characters are created by these different authors, and then they switch off the characters and write stories about them. So it's pretty cool. There's plenty of other books out there that have good character interaction, but that's probably one of my favorite. So go check that out if you can. You can find a copy at any used bookstore for like $1 or something. It's really a good read. So let's see. Knowing all this, and the other thing my students come to me about, they're like, well, I've had this character in my head for years, and I've drawn this character, my original character, for a long time. That's great. But I don't really think that way. I haven't really had like an original character in mind for a long time, because doing a lot of freelance work, I've had to time after time look at somebody else's idea and try to figure it out. So although it's cool to have an original character in the story, I think when you do character design, you need to kind of go away from that as much as possible. Try your best to think of some genre or something that maybe you're not comfortable with, or something that you're really passionate about, and kind of go around in that area in your mind. Sometimes when I'm teaching like an illustration class, like concept art, for instance, I don't, I put together ideas and I make students choose from them, but I don't allow them to like come to the table with their own thing. That would have to be like for a really advanced class where students were able to show me that they can come up with ideas on the fly based on something that they're not used to. And I think that's the other kind of cool thing about this. So that's why I think reading is important. So the more you read, the more like verbal ideas that you'll get, encounter, and then have to work with. And so you're not just thinking about your own stuff all the time. Okay. So with that said, this is a really fun exercise. It's great. It's kind of hard for people though, and here's why. and this isn't the only way that you can do character design, but this is the one that almost all my colleagues use. For instance, my friends at Floyd County Studios, where they make Archer, this is how they work. I've got friends in the video game industry. This is what they do, or this is what they're used to seeing. So the basic concept here is silhouette painting or silhouette design. So what is a silhouette? A silhouette is a shape. It's a shape that, let's say if you're looking at a person, it's just the outline of them filled in black. So you can't see any details. All you see is just their overall shape and then the edges of that shape. So let me pull up some of the silhouettes that I worked on before I came to do this recording today. So these are silhouettes. These are just basically flat shapes, and all I use is just black paint, and I use an eraser as well to kind of like pull out different parts of the shape. Now, this is hard for people, artists that haven't, really messed around with this, because we're really used to using lines when we draw. And that's okay. Because guess what? I was too for years. And until I started doing more painting, it was really tough for me to understand. Like, when I wanted to create a visual of something, my first impression is to use lines to do a drawing. And I still do that sometimes because, figure drawing, for instance, when I'm in a figure drawing scenario, it's really rare that I would like break out a marker or a piece of charcoal, big thick piece of charcoal, to do like a silhouette. Instead, I'm going to probably do something like this, which is like a gesture drawing. I'm trying to figure out like just the basic pieces of anatomy and stuff like that. I'm not really trying to think about entirely silhouette. I'm thinking about bigger shapes and stuff, but when you're drawing out of your head, I think approaching it with this method can be a little too complicated. I guess that's what I've started to learn over time, is that, there's nothing wrong with it, but certainly when you have to mass produce a lot of ideas, approaching it this way with line can actually be kind of hard, and it takes too long. So just bear with me here, and I want you to try something different. So to do a silhouette in Photoshop, you don't have to use Photoshop, by the way. You could easily use Procreate to do this. If you don't want to do digital, you can easily use a piece of paper. I recommend a large sheet of paper, and get a nice Sharpie marker or a really nice Copic marker, or something that has, like a nice chisel edge. Like, good Copics have a chisel edge end, right? And then they have like a nice fine tip on the other end. So that's a brand, a Copic pen. And of course, Sharpies are really good for this as well. If you can, though, also get some kind of whiteout type thing to use. So like whiteout's fine, but there's also liquid paper. It literally is just white opaque paint that comes in a small vial. It's like about this, it looks like a little, almost like makeup or something. Either that or just some really nice thick paint. And that way you can kind of paint into your black marks that you make with the Copic marker or Sharpie. There's all kinds of actually white ink pens too. And the only thing about those is they can be a little expensive, whereas like liquid paper and that kind of paint is much cheaper. Anything that's just really nice and opaque in terms of white paint would be great. And I would just get a brush that you use simply for that and nothing else, because the paint's going to be so thick, it's going to be hard to, constantly wash it out and use it for other kinds of painting. So I wouldn't recommend that. All right. So the other thing about this, I'll just go ahead and say it. and this is really hard to deliver to my students to teach them. The whole thing about this is iteration. And that's just a fancy word for doing something over and over. So, um, doing something repetitively. Because um, when you're doing this kind of work, you want to be able to have fun. And I think when it comes to character design, a lot of my students, and I can say this from my own experience, they get too hung up because they're thinking about something like a finished product that they've already seen. Like maybe a really awesome character painting they saw on ArtStation, or there's some like anime character they love that's on the cover of a comic book and it's just stuck in their head, like the way that it's rendered, the way that it's finished, and that's all they're thinking about. And guess what, this is just like that thing I was talking about earlier about that TV character. That's an image that's gone through this process many times. Okay, it's something that was designed and iterated over and over again until they got the exact image they wanted. Either that or whoever the artist was that produced that image had already done something like that many, many times. So that if you watch something on YouTube where somebody cranks out a character drawing that's like fully finished, guess what? They've probably done that many, many times. So when you sit down to do a character design, you shouldn't be thinking that way. You shouldn't be thinking, oh gosh, everything I draw has to be perfect and it has to look just like that awesome comic book cover I saw yesterday or whatever. You can't do that because you're kind of mentally blocking yourself from just having fun and just making doodles and quick shapes. Now there is a procedure to this though that I like to use. So um, I say silhouette design, but really what you have to reach back for here is 2D design. And this might sound, maybe really simple, but what I'm talking about is using simple shapes. So, I mean, like a square and a circle and a triangle. And if you want to use other geometric shapes, that's fine too. But the idea is that you want to consider these basic shapes and combining them in ways that's very interesting. And also the fact that you have to kind of make some decisions. Like for instance, I mentioned earlier, have some kind of genre in mind when you want to get started. So for me, that's easy. I just always go to fantasy. That's probably my favorite thing. So what I mean by fantasy is like, Lord of the Rings, Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of thing. So I'm thinking of certain character design uh, concepts that go along with these shapes, and I'll be able to demonstrate that when I start to draw. Now, if you don't like fantasy, you can do whatever you like. You could do like modern day characters. You could do science fiction. You could do horror. You could do post apocalypse. There's all these cool, story genres you could use. And I think whatever comes to mind, maybe, you know, all those shows that you like. Like if you really like Stranger Things, for instance, then you should do something like Supernatural or something cool like that. That's where it stops though. Like, just don't be overthinking like the favorite soup, like if you really love Eleven from Stranger Things, like get that out of your head. Like just think about the world that that character's in, but nothing more. And try to make it your own when you think about this, because that's the idea too, is you want to tell a story with, be help if I could spell right, story with your characters. Um, and sometimes you don't have a story, and that's okay. The story can kind of evolve as you're creating characters. That's kind of fun too. Um, and having experience reading stories, well written stories, I think is helpful with that as well, because you'll start to think of tropes or, let's just say common foils to a character, type, or, you know, like there's a team of characters that you really like and, you know, how their dynamic works or something. You can borrow from those ideas, like when you're designing characters, if you're doing more than one. So there's one more thing I want to say before we get started. Like, there's all this kind of, I guess, artistic stuff I just said, but then there's also a technological reason I'm asking you to do this. And this is really specific to digital art, okay? And we kind of talked about this a little bit in the Apple video. So if you haven't had a chance to watch my first video, please, you know, skip back and look at that. So the biggest thing here is that preserve transparency. Feature. And on the layers window, remember, it looks like this. It's the button with the little checkerboard. In Procreate, this is called alpha lock, and it's in the layer feature. So if you want to use the same technique in Procreate, you just use that instead. In other programs, I'm sure they have similar names. But here's the point. When you draw a silhouette, you can then use preserve transparency to capture that shape, right? So that when you go to paint it, or let's say hopefully some of us will get to today, you're going to add light and shadow to your silhouette, and then you don't have to worry about painting outside the lines, or better yet, you don't have to worry about destroying your silhouette. You can maintain what you've designed and then take it further. I have another video I'm going to do, which is like advanced rendering. And what I hope to do today is come up with at least one or two decent character designs that I'm going to get to a point where I can then bring into that video and do more advanced, you know, painting with it and show you how to render it. So that's what's so great about this. Not only are you using like a tried and true method of designing with silhouettes, but it also lends to digital painting using preserved transparency. So it's really just a match made in heaven. Now, for years before that, I was doing all kinds of crazy things, like using selections and having to go back and draw paths all the time. And I wish I had known this method sooner, because that took too long. It's not to say that I don't use those things when I paint, but I certainly don't use them as the main way of painting anymore, because this is so much faster and it's more fresh. That's the other thing. You don't want to overdo your work. You don't want to beat things to death, and you want to keep ideas fresh. So I'm going to keep this layer here because, you know, you might want those notes later. So how does this work? What tools do I need? We actually need a new window that I didn't talk about on the first video, and that window is called Brush Settings. So I'm going to open that up. It's kind of scary looking, but don't freak out. There's actually not much we're going to do with this. I just need it available because what this window does, it allows you to customize a brush. And I hope we can kind of cover that on the fourth video. It's a little bit technical, but it takes some time. But just trust me when I say that this list of checkboxes here that you see, I'm going to try to zoom in on that. These are elements of brush design that allows you to mimic like a traditional brush. And there's one in particular we want to get rid of, and that's transfer. And I'll explain why in a minute. So we need that, but that's really it. Besides that, we just need to make sure we're using our layers properly. So I'm going to show you the layers here. I've got my BG, which is that gray background we had in the first video. This is actually the same file. I've just grouped all the Apple stuff over here, and I'm going to do my new work for this video in this set of layers. The only other layer we need right now is just a silhouette layer. So I'm going to just call this Sil for short, and maybe just call it number 1. And the one thing about this technique, it's not unlike what I showed you for the apple, you really have to kind of pay attention to your layers. That's really important. For instance, if I'm painting accidentally in the gray background, that is not going to let this work properly. So always do your silhouettes in their own layer and make sure that your background is gray. I don't like white because it's too bright, number one. It's hard on the eyes, and it also kind of uh, makes it more difficult to work with such a contrast between black and the white background. So the gray is a little softer on the eyes, and it's actually just makes it a little easier to manipulate such a darker value with this middle one in between. So I do like to use just black on this. You don't have to, I guess, but I think it's just faster and easier. So you can hit D on your keyboard in Photoshop, what the letter D. What that does is it changes the foreground color, which is this top square, to black, and then the one underneath it is the background color, and that changes to white. Now we don't need to worry about that. Just make sure that you're using black. All right, so for the brush, I'm not actually going to use my custom brushes this time. I'm going to just pick one of these brush shapes that's already built into Photoshop. Or if you want, just go to the general brushes and let's pick the hardest brush that's there. So you want something that says hard round or something like that. So I'm going to come out here and kind of mess with that right now. That looks pretty good. I want a brush that when I hit the page, it makes it immediate mark like so, and it's really dark. So I don't want it to be like this. Let's see if I can get this to work. If it does this, right, where it looks kind of cloudy sometimes, that means that there's pressure active on the brush. So if I push real hard, it gets very opaque and dark. But if I use a little bit of pressure, see how it looks kind of washed out? That's opacity at work. So that's no good. So to change that, go to brush settings. If you see transfer clicked, I want you to unclick that. Okay. So what that does now is it makes the brush super strong and very, like, it's almost like using a Sharpie marker, right? So if you're still seeing some problems, look up here. There's a little strip at the top. If you don't see this window, it's called Options. And if you go to Window in the main menu, you'll see it towards the bottom. What's really cool about this is there's some other controls you can mess with. So if you see flow or opacity at anything under 100%, I would recommend that you slide it over to 100. That way you know for sure that you're going to have a really strong brush like that. The other tool we're going to use is the eraser tool. So press E and just do the same thing. In the brush shapes, try to find just the basic white circle like this, hard round, and then do the same thing as before. Make sure that transfer is not selected, and make sure the flow and the opacity are at full. And the reason for this is, again, what I'm trying to get you to try to do here is paint and then take away. Paint and then take away. So you press B to paint and E to erase or to take away. And you're not drawing with a line. You're actually drawing with what I like to say is area or shape. So now that we have that in place, it's just a matter of, like I said, like coming up with a genre and then just going with the flow and see what you can come up with. So I'm going to start with, I am doing fantasy. So I'm just going to draw a couple of shapes here. And I'm not really thinking too much about it. Now, there is some psychology built into all this as well. So I think, for instance, circle indicates kind of something round, which could be something kind of chubby or cheerful or, kind of maybe lazy or something like that. whereas square is very stoic, maybe, and strong, broad shoulders, that kind of thing. And then like a triangle, depending on the angle of the triangle, could be something maybe more regal, like that. Or if it's a triangle like this, maybe it's more feminine, or kind of elegant or something like that. So that's what I pretty much do is I just start with some shapes like this, and then I start to erase out parts. And I think music is really important here. I'm a big fan of listening to music while you work. So if there's some kind of like, I don't know, soundtrack or something that you really like or whatever, listen to that because it'll help you kind of create energy for what you're trying to do. So I'm taking these basic shapes and I'm slightly changing them a little bit at a time. Not to be corny, but this is kind of like the famous Michelangelo quote. You know, I think it's the idea like, how do you plan the sculptures that you create? And he would always say, well, the sculpture's already there. I just got to remove the excess rock or marble to make it come out. This is kind of the same. You want to kind of just find that basic shape and carve stuff out of it and take away things you don't need. And then just, you know, add some more detail as you go, but not too much. By the way, if you don't remember, the brush tool and the eraser tool, you can hit the square bracket, the left square bracket, and the right bracket to make the brush bigger or smaller. So I'm constantly doing that. I'm like constantly hitting those keys. I really want to look out on the internet and see if there's some kind of plug-in that makes that a little bit easier. I mean, I don't know what that would be, but just anything to maybe like a button, maybe a gesture instead of hitting a button. That would be really cool to be able to do that. Okay, so there's that guy. Now, I don't try to spend too much time on this. I'm watching the clock, and it's really hard to do this, but try not to overdo or spend too much time on stuff. You want to just kind of fool around with it and just see what happens. So I'm envisioning this is like some kind of queen or something, and she has this big like fur, I don't know, what do you call this? That thing that goes over your shoulders. I don't know. Yeah, like an ermine or something like that. All right. So how about I like push this a little bit more, make the figure a little bit more like this, like hourglass shaped. The other thing I should mention is that although I don't have a whole lot of time to do as much as I'd like, I think that you have to spend a good amount of time making these because I want to say, I don't know, 75% of what I draw is just garbage. You know, like it's either not going to work or I was, you know, getting distracted or something while I was drawing it, or I'm trying to think of some other thing. So my mind is always bouncing around. It's just not that easy sometimes to do these. And that's normal. All right, so what I just did there is I'm using the lasso key, which is the L key, and I drew a lasso around this silhouette, and then use the V key to move it around. So if you want to, you know, make some space, that's the way that I do that. So L is for lasso, and V is for move. That's the move tool. And L is lasso. And lasso is just a way to make a selection, of course. We talked about that actually last time. Okay, so I'm going to move on to this next guy here. The other thing that comes up with this, and this is another subject that students ask me about all the time, is do you make your characters realistic, or are they more comic booky or cartoony? I don't know. Sometimes I make them really realistic, and sometimes I make them more cartoony. I think what's cool about this technique is it kind of forces you to maybe do something you're not used to. Like, if you're always worried about your characters being realistic, you're not pushing proportions that much, maybe, or you're worried too much about finding that magic proportion to everything you draw. You know, that's cool. But you know what? You could do an exaggerated character design and then tone it down. I know anybody, you know, what this is, May 25th, 2020. The big thing going around on Instagram right now is redesigning that Sailor Moon character. And I'm sorry, I don't know who it is. I don't really know a lot about Sailor Moon. All I know is that it's the blonde character, and it's really interesting because the versions that I've seen out there range from these incredible, like, you know, realistic designs that look kind of like somebody got casted into the role of this character, right? And then was painted. And then I see just these incredibly wacky, weird, you know, cartoon versions and stuff, you know, and that's really great. But you can kind of get my point, is that you could start with something really cartoony just to get the feel of the character, tell a story with it. And then if you really wanted to make it more realistic, that wouldn't be hard to do. You might lose some of the flavor, but at least, you know, it's just the concept of the character that's there that you can go back and redesign. So don't ever forget that. Just because I'm maybe leaning towards something more comical, it doesn't mean that it couldn't be changed into something more realistic later on. I guess it's more important. It's not just how it looks. It's what story is being conveyed by this design that you're doing. That's just as important. Do you have to always draw your characters when you design them from the front? No, you don't. If you want to do a profile, that's totally cool. Nothing wrong with that. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm kind of like just mixing this up a little bit, and I want to draw kind of this female character. I think I kind of would like to do something more like a hunter or something like that. That'd be kind of cool. That still has that shape. Because before I was talking about, you know, regal, but I think you can have the hint of that and still have a character that's maybe more rough and tumble. So maybe she has a coat or something that splits here, and then that's what gives it that V shape, right? Again, it's just all about being open-minded. I think if you can just pick a genre that you really like and kind of stick to that, and just go with the flow, like, you know, look at these shapes and don't overthink it, and just do a couple of doodles, and then you'll have fun. All right. Now there's other things you can do. There's other tricks out there. I'll go ahead and show you this. I'll mess around with this one, with these tricks that I'm thinking of in Photoshop. For instance, there's two things. The first one is transformations. So transform is a form of editing, and edit is one of the menu options we have here. So if you go to edit, transform, there's a bunch of different transformations we can do. Now, I'll go ahead and say it. The only way you could get away with this traditionally is to, like, and I used to do this, is use a photocopier and like move the paper around or something like that while the light is going across the panel, to stretch something out or to compress it or to shorten it. I've done stuff like that all back in grad school. It's not very accurate, first of all, but digitally speaking, this is definitely more of a thing you can do. So the one I like to mess with is distort. So what this allows me to do is like just slightly maybe push the shape a little bit more, because I was going for that triangle shape. So I'm just going to kind of mess with that a little bit and push that around just a little bit more. Another trick you can do is, this one's a little bit more complicated, but it's a filter, and it's called liquify. Now, this is a little bit more taxing on the CPU. So if you have a computer that's like not too strong, this can be a problem. But what happens is it drops into this new window, as you can see, and this red stuff indicates what's outside of my selection. I'm not really worried about that. But over here are some tools I can use. So this one at the very top looks like a finger pushing into some paper or something. That's called forward warp. So what I can do with this is I can like take a big brush like this and push around all these parts of the silhouette, just to kind of, again, mess around with the shape, change it a little bit, and then go back and see what happens. So there's all these really cool things that you can do with your silhouettes before you even start to do the next phase, which we're about to do. And I'm pushing like 45 minutes here, so I think what I'm going to do is we'll start by, there's a couple of thumbnails that I really liked from the previous round that I did, so I want to go back and show you those and do this next stage. So this is some silhouettes I cranked out before I started doing the video, and I really kind of, am stuck on this idea of a dwarf. So I really like this guy right here. I think he looks really cool, and I'm gonna mess with that. And just to show you, like the first round I did, I don't like really any of these. Like these are just, see how clunky they look and just how they're kind of boring. I wasn't really pushing myself too far. I was trying to just do some basic shapes and stuff. But then when I kept working and did more silhouettes, this is what I came up with. So it just takes time to warm up. If you don't draw regularly, which I think you should, you got to give yourself at least 30 minutes just to push stuff around and get a feel for things before I would even begin to select any of these silhouettes to use for a potential character, because you just need to get your mind into it. And the more that you do this, it's like anything, it's like athletics, actually. Nobody should go into a game without warming up or without having practiced, because obviously you won't do well. It's just that whole repetitive nature of doing anything physical. It takes time for your mind to get straight with your body so that you're actually executing what you want versus, being distracted or unpracticed. So now that I've got all these silhouettes, what can I do now? Like how do you proceed? Well, I personally now like to be able to use line. Where I said before, I used to do line right away. I don't do that anymore. I actually have to do line on top of a silhouette now. So this is where you need to be cognizant of layers. That's really important. So I'm going to call this silhouette number 2. And by the way, if you're messing around with this. The canvas is the same as before. It's 17 inches wide and 11 inches tall. And I think you should do something similar. And I would recommend doing at least 2 or 3 pages of these silhouettes before you even think about doing this next step. And the only reason I'm saying that is because, again, you got to give yourself time. If you try to just do 2 or 3 of these and then just start to draw, I promise you're not going to like it. You're going to be like, this isn't what I wanted. Well, yeah, because if you've never done this before, I would recommend doing even more than that. I would do like maybe 3 or 4 pages or 5 maybe, just so you can practice. Okay, so once you find some silhouettes you really think are good, like I like this one. This is probably the only one I did today that I thought was decent. Maybe this guy right here is not too bad, but I really like this one. So what I like to do, it's very simple. With this layer selected, I'm going to adjust it with a filter. Well, it's an adjustment. It's under Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation. What this is going to allow me to do is use this special adjustment to change this from being strictly black to something a little lighter. So I'm going to select this window, and it's got all these controls and stuff, and it looks a little complicated, but the only one I care about actually is lightness. And it's funny because I don't usually use lightness when I'm working on a painting to do small adjustments and color adjustments, color correction. This is perfect though for what I'm trying to do here. So I'm going to take the lightness slider bar here, grab it, and then pull it slightly to the right, just a little bit at a time, until I see what I want. So I'd say like plus 25 is pretty good. I think it just depends on the person. The point here is that now we're going to draw on top of this silhouette with a dark line, and I need to be able to see it. So I can't do that if it's back here, really dark. I need to make it a little bit lighter like that. Okay, so now what I can do is make a new layer, and I'm going to call this Sketch. This is very much like when we did the apple. I don't know if you remember, but we drew a shape and filled it. But this time I've got that already done, and now I'm going to come back and do the line work instead on top of it. So I'm just going to sketch here. You can use my brushes if you want, or you can use the dry media brush, Ultimate Hard Pencil. I think that's more than adequate. That one's already built in. So let me show that again. Kind of did that too fast. So this is under the brush window. Just go to General Brushes and select Dry Media Brushes, and then Kyle's Ultimate Pencil. It's actually pretty good. Now, making sure I'm in that new layer, I'm going to come back in here now and just start to doodle. And I don't really care about staying in the lines. That's not that important. All I'm trying to do now is, when I've got this form created, I'm going to come back in here now and draw what I think this character and his details look like. And I'm going to start just with some basic big lines, like, okay, here's his face and his beard, and his arm is obviously maybe a little foreshortened or something. Maybe he has kind of a belly like this. Maybe this is armor, like pieces of armor. Now, I'm not going to worry about that, in terms of detail. If I'm going to make some choices like that, like this is going to be like a piece of armor on his shoulder or something, I'm going to have to go get references for that, because now I've drawn a lot of that in the past, but I'm a big fan of finding references for stuff after the fact. Like, I know I want to draw, like, this is going to be like studded armor, right? I don't know if that's exactly what it looks like, but that's kind of what I'm after. I kind of want them to look like a barrel, like this. But I can always go find that later. you know, I don't have to worry about that too much right this second. All right. Now, what I like, probably my favorite thing about working like this is getting surprised. Like, yeah, when I was doing this at first, I thought, I definitely wanted a dwarf, and I carved out some of these pieces and stuff. But then when you go to draw, there's these little passages and stuff that you didn't notice at first. And when you go back to draw, you're like, oh, that's so cool. Like this little curvy part here at the bottom. What is that? Like, how can I make that look really neat? And, how does this attach to this piece of wood? Do I want something coming out of there? It's like it draws itself. Like I don't have to think. It's just like, oh, hey, that makes sense. I'll just do that. And it's really fun. I really love doing this. I think it's a fun way of working. And your characters, I think, are a little bit more dynamic because, again, you're basing it off of the shape. You're not basing it off a line drawing that you're probably getting too worked up about. And if here's the thing: like, if you practice this enough, even if you get to this point, and you're like, well, gosh, I just really don't like that. Well, then you can erase all this and try it again, and see what happens. Or just move on to another thumbnail, another silhouette. Like that took me about, I don't know what, like 2 minutes. I think he needs like a little cool collar here or something like that. Give him some eyebrows. Maybe he needs like a mohawk or something. I don't know. Maybe not. I don't like that. He's just bald or something. Definitely into some ears. That would be cool. All right. So I'm going to sketch in his hand here. Maybe he's got a sack or something that he's carrying, or maybe there's like some other, like he's carrying a mug of beer. That would be kind of neat. Something like that. Not sure. But you get the idea. And then you just keep going. Like, I'm going to do, it's almost an hour. I'm going to do a couple more of these, I think. Now, this character, I don't know. It just kind of, when I put it together, it kind of seemed like a cute character. And I talk about this all the time. One of the things that will happen is when you're doing this kind of work, you'll see these impressions of things in your mind just kind of happen. And it's hard to control that. Like, for instance, I think when I first drew this, I kind of thought it looked like Finn from Adventure Time. And sometimes that's really hard to avoid. I guess I'm thinking he's, this guy's maybe a halfling or something, and maybe he lives somewhere that's really cold, so he has to wear this really heavy thing. Maybe it's not like made from a bear fur, it's just made to look like that. Because he just doesn't seem like a hunter to me. Maybe he's a fisherman. I'm not against the cute thing. I think that can be really fun, but that's just not my, I typically draw characters that are a little bit more serious, I guess. I don't know. I should probably do more cute stuff. I'm not really sure what he's doing with his hands. That's kind of strange. And I think his arm would maybe be a little higher here. So he's obviously carrying something. So I would have to add on to the silhouette later. We're going to do that, I think, in the next video where we do more advanced stuff. Because even this dwarf guy's got some parts that are kind of sticking out. that aren't part of the silhouette, and that's okay. And there's some parts that maybe need to be taken away. We're going to come back and work on that later. I mentioned I really like this guy, so I'm going to kind of mess with this dude for a minute. This guy started out as a triangle that was really skinny towards the bottom, and then I put like a circle at the top for his head. I guess I kind of thought this was like an elf guy or something, but I'm not so sure. Ultimately, what we're going to do is try and make it so that when we're ready to draw and paint this character more realistically, that the silhouette will provide the ability for us to do very fast additions of light and shadow. And the line work will allow us to understand more subtlety like costume, expression, and other design elements like that. And then eventually this all gets kind of painted over, or like I guess let's just say absorbed into the painting, right? Because that's the other thing I want to be clear about. This is very preliminary, and the end product will still have the basic silhouette and the information that this line is telling us, but it'll be much removed from that. Don't be afraid of hands. Maybe what I can do is in that same video as this next video we'll do is I'll talk about how to draw hands and things like that. Probably my favorite book for that, it's called Book of 100, or it could be 100, I'm not sure, hands. And the author is Bridgman. George Bridgman. He's an artist from the early 20th century. I'd say early to mid. And he did this several books about how to draw anatomy from your head, just from his copious amounts of figure drawing work that he did. And one of those books is just hands. It literally is 100 drawings of hands. You can still buy these pretty easily. It comes in this neat little folio size book. It's probably like 5 inches by 8 inches, or smaller than that maybe. And I recommend getting that book and drawing every single figure, every drawing of hands that you see, you need to draw those hands too. And I would practice those over and over again. And then of course draw from life. And don't try to draw your own hand. That's okay, but get somebody else to pose for you. When you have to draw your own hand, it's too much of a distraction. I've never really cared for that. I don't think it works very well. So either have a photograph to work from, or also use an art book like this book of 100 hands. I think that's a great way to practice. By the way, when it comes to figure work, there are plenty of online resources out there right now that are doing virtual figure drawing with nude and clothed models. If some of you out there are, still kind of younger, I suppose that's really up to your parent/guardian. But there are plenty of really great resources of live video modeling proctored by artists. The Visual Passage is the one that I've been using lately. I don't know if they're still doing this or not, but during this time of the lockdowns and, stay at home stuff, every Thursday night they've done live figure drawing. There's also some models that I know that, they do the same thing, like they, for a nominal fee, like what you would pay at a actual real life figure drawing session. They will do like a Zoom room or something like that, where you're also uh, just drawing from a live model. And if you haven't had any experience before with figure drawing, that's maybe not the best thing to try, but it is something that you're actually able to draw from life with an actual figure. All right. So this guy maybe has a bunch of baubles and jewelry and stuff like that. So it's kind of what I was thinking. Maybe the climate he lives in is really warm, so he has to wear, all these things to protect him from the sun, and also provide some, cooling down with perspiration soaked and all that to make his skin cooler. Okay. So there you go. I think the other thing that's cool about this and the way it's kind of random is, again, it forces you to think outside the box. When I think of elves, a lot of times I think of like Legolas from Lord of the Rings. Well, I don't want my elves to all look exactly like Orlando Bloom or something like that. So I want it to be something different. And I think using silhouettes forces you out of that mindset, because you're not thinking, oh, I'm going to draw Orlando Bloom or he's stuck in my head. You're actually being forced to deal with this strange shape that you've painted and kind of make it work. And using those cues, like I said, the triangle shape kind of makes them look skinny and maybe a little bit elegant, or just a little bit more like maybe mysterious or something like that. Whereas this dwarf over here, he looks really stout and kind of fat and like a warrior guy or something like that. So the story that's evoking from these two characters is like something totally different. But they could be in the same world and they could be interacting with each other, because I'm trying to tell that story as well. So that's, to me, we're hitting an hour here. So I would say that's like the basic thing I would ask you to try here. And what we're going to do is not the next video, because the next one I think I'm going to do probably something more like a advanced still life or maybe a portrait or something like that, and talk about advanced painting techniques, or I'd say like intermediate ones. And then on the very last video, I'll take one of these guys and we're going to talk more about how to use silhouettes and push them into a painting. So we go beyond just doing the silhouette in the sketch. We're actually going to render them and make them look cool, and then we'll put them like in a simple background or something. So you don't really need any special files for this one, but if you still have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to share these files, by the way. So if you want the PSD files to look at, I have no problem with that at all. So here's my email again. And if you have any questions or want to contact me about any of the stuff we talked about today, feel free to do so. Thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope you can join me on the next video.